This is the time when a serial killer committed horrific acts in the past and is now facing the consequences. Here are 7 killers who have been sentenced to life.
The bodies of 9 of his victims were exhumed as part of the police investigation.
Found with a quantity that much.
On each of the 7 offences of murder.
Beverly Allitt, also a nurse in her 20s.
Tyrone Johnson. In the tragic case of Tyrone Johnson, the sequence of events leading to his incarceration unfolds with grim clarity. In 2018, Tyrone fatally shot his girlfriend, Stephanie Willis, and her young son, Ricky, in Florida. The incident occurred during a dispute over a television remote, escalating tragically into violence that claimed 2 lives. Following his arrest, Tyrone's interactions with law enforcement revealed his shock and confusion over his own actions. During questioning, he struggled to recount the events clearly, often needing reassurance and encouragement to stay calm. His version of events differed significantly from the prosecution's narrative, which painted a picture of deliberate violence rather than an accident gone awry. In court, the prosecution presented evidence that seemed to contradict Tyrone's account. Physical evidence, such as shell casings and bloodstains, pointed to a more deliberate act, rather than a spontaneous outburst. Despite Tyrone's remorseful demeanor and apologies to the victims' families, the court sentenced him to death for what was deemed a heinous and cruel crime. Throughout the legal proceedings, Tyrone's defense team attempted to portray the incident as a tragic accident, a moment of panic and confusion that spiraled out of control. They argued against premeditation, suggesting instead a chaotic situation that tragically claimed lives. Neil Simpson. In the case of Neil Simpson, convicted of murder and other charges in Ohio, his reaction to receiving a life sentence provides a chilling glimpse into the mindset of some criminals facing severe consequences for their actions. Neil Simpson's criminal history culminated in 2007 when he fatally shot Dave Kowalczyk during a robbery at a pizza shop. After fleeing the scene, he was apprehended and brought to trial, where he faced the wrath of jurors who found him guilty. During the sentencing phase, Simpson's behavior was notably defiant and disrespectful. He spat on jurors and hurled curses at them, displaying a blatant disregard for the judicial process and the gravity of his crimes. Despite the overwhelming evidence against him and emotional testimony from the victim's family describing their profound loss, Simpson maintained his innocence. He adamantly denied any involvement in the murder, claiming he was unjustly accused and refusing to accept responsibility for his actions. In a bizarre twist, Simpson even requested the death penalty, offering provocative suggestions for his execution. He proposed being crucified or stoned to death by the victim's family, demonstrating a disturbing lack of remorse and a willingness to further traumatize those affected by his crimes. Lastly, the judge sentenced Neil Simpson to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Joseph McAlpin. Joseph McAlpin's case in Ohio exemplifies the profound and often contentious reactions of individuals facing life sentences or death penalties for heinous crimes. In April 2017, McAlpin committed aggravated murder when he fatally shot a couple who owned a car dealership, along with their dog, during a robbery. His audacious actions and subsequent behavior during his trial mirrored those of other notorious criminals. Representing himself in court, McAlpin displayed a mix of defiance and emotional volatility. He cross-examined witnesses vigorously, questioning their credibility and asserting his innocence vehemently. Despite overwhelming evidence presented by the prosecution, including eyewitness testimonies and forensic evidence, McAlpin adamantly maintained that he was falsely accused and unjustly convicted. During sentencing, McAlpin's demeanor fluctuated between emotional outbursts and moments of apparent calmness. He invoked personal hardships from his upbringing and called upon family members to testify on his behalf, attempting to portray himself sympathetically despite the gravity of his crimes. However, the prosecution and the victims' families presented a starkly different narrative. Councilman Mike Paletic, speaking on behalf of the victims, condemned McAlpin's actions as demonic and emphasized the brutality of the murders. The prosecution argued for consecutive sentences, citing the need to protect the public from future harm and to appropriately punish McAlpin for his crimes. Despite McAlpin's assertions of innocence and impassioned pleas, the jury handed down a death sentence based on aggravating circumstances outweighing mitigating factors. Even in the face of this sentence, McAlpin continued to proclaim his innocence, alleging that crucial evidence had been withheld during his trial. Stephen Lorenzo. Stephen Lorenzo's reaction to receiving a life sentence for his heinous crimes against his victims was marked by a chilling mixture of defiance and resignation. As the judge pronounced the verdict, Stephen, representing himself in court, appeared composed yet tense. He sought clarification from a survivor about his purported plans, attempting to cast doubt on the prosecution's narrative. His questions, delivered with an air of detachment, aimed to challenge the testimonies against him, probing into details of alleged social engagements that never transpired. During the sentencing phase, Stephen's demeanor shifted as he listened to statements from the victims' families. Their emotional accounts of loss and suffering seemed to momentarily unsettle him. One family member, stricken with grief and anger, confronted Stephen directly, expressing visceral disdain for the havoc he had wrought upon their lives. The intensity of these emotional outbursts seemed to visibly affect Stephen, although his facial expressions remained inscrutable for the most part. Stephen's own statement before the court revealed a surprising request. He openly expressed a preference for the death penalty, citing a desire for comfort and privacy in a solitary cell, away from the general prison population. This request, though unusual, underscored Stephen's detachment from the gravity of his crimes and his calculated approach to his own fate. Ultimately, the judge, Christopher Sabella, acknowledged the factual basis of Stephen's guilty plea and proceeded to sentence him accordingly. Despite Stephen's request for death, the judge pronounced a life sentence, reflecting the legal proceedings and perhaps a symbolic denial of Stephen's preferred fate. Throughout the proceedings, Stephen's reactions painted a picture of a man disconnected from the moral implications of his actions, focused instead on his personal comfort and legal strategy. His attempts to challenge the prosecution and his unusual request for the death penalty highlighted his stark indifference to the suffering he had caused, contrasting sharply with the raw emotions expressed by the victims' families. Granville Ritchie. When emotions run high in court, Granville Ritchie's reaction to receiving a life sentence for his crimes was a contrast to the heartfelt pain expressed by the victim's family. Throughout the trial, the prosecution painted a grim picture of Granville as a manipulative and deceitful individual who callously disregarded Felicia Williams's life for his own desires. They presented compelling evidence, including a distressing 911 call made from Granville's phone during Felicia's disappearance. Despite the prosecution's case, Granville's defense argued vehemently against his guilt, pointing out the absence of physical evidence linking him directly to the crime. They highlighted the lack of DNA or signs of struggle in the apartment where Felicia was last seen, casting doubt on the accusations against him. During the sentencing phase, Felicia's family members confronted Granville, expressing their profound grief and the devastating impact his actions had on their lives. The victim's father's remarkable act of forgiveness stood out amidst the anguish, offering a message of spiritual redemption even in the face of unbearable loss. The judge delivered a solemn verdict, sentencing Granville Ritchie to life in prison without the possibility of parole. This decision marked the end of a legal battle that had spanned years, bringing some closure to the victim's loved ones while leaving Granville to contemplate his fate behind bars. When serial killers face life sentences in court, their reactions can range from bizarre attempts at sincerity to outright disrespect. B2, K-killer take Dennis Rader, also known as the BTK killer, for instance. As he stood in the courtroom facing 10 consecutive life sentences without parole for his gruesome crimes, he took the opportunity to deliver what seemed like an acceptance speech at an award ceremony. Rader's speech was self-centered and lacked genuine remorse. He praised jailers and law enforcement, critiqued the district attorney's presentations, and even tried to find common ground with his victims, describing them in almost complimentary terms. His words, however, rang hollow, describing his victims as wonderful, while acknowledging his predatory actions painted a chilling picture of his detachment from reality. District Attorney Nora Falston, visibly taken aback, likened Rader's performance to the Golden Globe Awards, mocking his attempts to garner sympathy or understanding. Throughout his rambling speech, which included irrelevant personal anecdotes and attempts to humanize himself, many attendees, especially the victims' families, expressed their disgust and disbelief by leaving the courtroom, the spectacle resembling an inappropriate public performance rather than a sincere acknowledgement of guilt. Timothy Jones Jr. In a South Carolina courtroom, Timothy Jones Jr. faced a harrowing trial accused of the brutal murders of his 5 young children: 2-year-old Gabriel, 7-year-old Elias, 1-year-old Abigail, 8-year-old Mira, and 6-year-old Naughton. The trial was marked by chilling testimony from witnesses, including law enforcement officers who discovered evidence of decomposition emanating from Timothy's vehicle. They described finding disturbing items like muriatic acid, bleach, and tools that suggested an attempt to conceal or destroy evidence. Despite the gravity of these revelations, Timothy remained impassive, showing little emotion as the evidence against him mounted. The prosecution presented compelling accounts, including Timothy's ex-wife's testimony detailing a disturbing phone call where he chastised their son, demonstrating a callous disregard for their well-being. FBI agents also testified about Timothy's demeanor during questioning, recounting his evasive responses and attempts to deflect responsibility for his actions. Despite efforts by the defense to argue mental instability and psychosis as mitigating factors, the jury found Timothy guilty on all counts related to the murders of his children. The verdict was a culmination of the overwhelming evidence presented, leaving little doubt about his culpability. During the sentencing phase, the courtroom atmosphere was charged with anguish and anger. The victim's mother delivered a heart-wrenching statement, denouncing Timothy's actions as unforgivable and pleading for justice. In contrast, the defense continued to emphasize Timothy's mental health issues, attempting to sway the jury towards a lesser sentence. And that's it today. If you want to see something more crazy and horrifying than that, then you click on this video on screen.